She laughed at the gift I made with love. I stayed silent and sold the wedding venue she bragged about. Subscribe to my channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. This is my story. The brush strokes were still wet when I wrapped the canvas. Every shade captured 4 generations of our family in oil paints, with spaces for future children. I'd worked for weeks, my arthritic fingers cramping, but I pushed through the pain. This was my olive branch after 45 years of estrangement. "Grandma has a special gift for you, Amber," Caroline announced with artificial sweetness. The rehearsal dinner guests turned to watch as I carried the large package toward my granddaughter. My heart hammered against my ribs. At 72, I wasn't used to being the center of attention, especially in this Boston mansion filled with people who made me feel like an intruder. What could it be? Amber's smile tightened. She wore a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly pension. "I made this for you, sweetheart." My voice wavered as I handed her the carefully wrapped canvas, "for your new home with Ryan." Her manicured fingers tore through the paper. The room fell silent as the family portrait was revealed. I'd poured my soul into capturing Thomas's eyes, my son's eyes, the same shade as my late husband David's. I saw it immediately, the flash of disgust before Amber composed herself. How traditional. Her voice dropped to a stage whisper. She held the painting awkwardly, like something found in the trash. "Thank you, Grandma. We'll find somewhere special for it." She snapped her fingers at a server. "Could you please take this somewhere safe?" The young man whisked away my heart's work before I could say another word. "Now, about the flowers for tomorrow." Caroline seamlessly redirected the conversation. I retreated to a corner, my cheeks burning. Thomas avoided my eyes, focused on his bourbon. I should have been used to his indifference after 45 years. Hours later, I slipped away seeking quiet. Following laughter down a hallway, I slowed my steps. "Seriously, the look on her face," Amber was saying, her words slurred from champagne. "As if I'd hang that monstrosity in our new place. What will you do with it?" A bridesmaid's voice. "That thing? God, it belongs in a thrift store. My grandmother lives in some fantasy world where her little paintings matter. As if throwing money at my wedding makes up for abandoning my dad when he was 8. The glass of water in my hand slipped, shattering against the marble floor. The laughter stopped. I stood exposed in the doorway, water seeping into my sensible shoes, as 4 pairs of eyes turned to me. Amber's weren't apologetic. They were challenging, so I didn't make a scene. I simply turned and walked away, my spine straight, despite the knife they'd plunged into my back. That night, alone in the guest room, I made a decision. No more sacrificial lamb, no more silent acceptance. They had no idea what I was capable of. The morning after the rehearsal dinner humiliation, I awoke before dawn. My body ached, but my mind was clearer than it had been in years. I dressed quickly and slipped out while the household slept. My rental car started reluctantly. I followed the GPS to Millfield, watching Boston's skyline recede. The 90-minute drive gave me time to think. Millfield hadn't changed much in the 30 years since I'd last visited. The same oak trees lined Main Street, their branches now fuller. I parked outside a cafe that occupied a storefront I once knew as Mitchell's Hardware. "Just coffee, please," I told the young waitress. My hands trembled as I called Dorothy Wilson, my former mother-in-law's housekeeper. I'd kept her number, one of the few connections to my past I'd maintained. "Maggie Sullivan," her voice crackled with surprise. "What brings you to call at 7 in the morning?" "I'm in Millfield, Dorothy, and I need your help." 20 minutes later, Dorothy's Buick pulled into the parking lot. At 84, she moved slowly, but with purpose. "You look terrible," she said, sliding into the booth. "I feel worse," I admitted. I told her everything. The wedding invitation that felt obligatory, the mansion that made me feel small, the painting they'd mocked, the words I wasn't meant to hear. "Those people," Dorothy muttered. "Your in-laws poisoned Thomas against you, and now his wife and daughter carry on the tradition." "I don't know what to do," I confessed. "Part of me wants to drive back to Connecticut and forget I ever came. Another part wants to fight," Dorothy finished. "It's about time, Maggie." "Fight how? They've had decades to build their narrative." Dorothy's eyes narrowed. "Did you ever wonder how your in-laws afforded that big house after retirement? How Thomas went to that expensive private school? They said David's life insurance covered the basics." Dorothy laughed sharply. "Life insurance. Right." She leaned forward. "When was the last time you saw Richard Hamilton?" "David's lawyer," Not since the funeral in 1980. Because Richard has been trying to find you for years. Your in-laws told everyone you'd moved abroad after David died. Then, when they passed in 2010, Thomas maintained the same story. Find me for what? For your money, Maggie. For your property. Dorothy's voice dropped. Did you know your husband bought shares in Lakeside Manor before he died? That investment made a fortune over the years. The coffee turned bitter in my mouth. That's impossible. There was nothing left after his medical bills. That's what they wanted you to believe. Dorothy's eyes held mine. And guess where your granddaughter is getting married tomorrow? The realization hit me like a physical blow. Lakeside Manor. Exactly. The property you partially own is hosting your granddaughter's wedding. How do you know all this? I worked for your in-laws for 15 years after you left. I saw the paperwork, the monthly statements. When I questioned them once, they threatened to fire me. I had my own children to feed. Shame clouded her features. And Richard? He knows I'm alive? He hired a private investigator about 5 years ago when the property began restructuring. Thomas intercepted the contact somehow. My hands stopped trembling. Something cold and determined settled in my chest. I need to see Richard, I said, standing. Today, Dorothy smiled. He's expecting us at 9. Richard Hamilton's office smelled of leather and paper. The attorney himself seemed frozen in time. Older, certainly, but still wearing the same tortoiseshell glasses, still arranging his pens in perfect alignment. Margaret, he said, rising. After all these years. It's Maggie now, I corrected gently. Of course. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Dorothy took the seat beside me, her presence a silent support. I understand my husband made an investment before he died, I said, skipping pleasantries. An investment I was never told about. Richard sighed, removing his glasses. David purchased an 8% stake in Lakeside Manor 3 months before his diagnosis. It was meant to be a surprise, a secure investment for your future. He signed the papers but died before the final processing. Legally, the shares fell to you as his widow, but I never saw a penny. Because your in-laws acted as intermediaries, Richard opened a drawer and extracted a folder. They presented a power of attorney document, forged, as I later discovered, claiming you had authorized them to manage your affairs while you were establishing yourself in Chicago. By the time I grew suspicious, they had redirected the quarterly payments to accounts they controlled. He slid the folder toward me. Inside were decades of financial statements, copies of checks, legal correspondence. My head swam at the figures. And now? I asked. Now, Lakeside Manor is undergoing a corporate restructuring. All shareholders must sign off or sell their shares by the end of the month. I've been attempting to contact you directly for months. But my son has been intercepting your messages, I finished. Richard nodded. When I learned from Dorothy you'd be in town for the wedding, at Lakeside Manor of all places, I hoped we might finally connect. Does my family know I own part of the venue? Thomas was notified as your supposed representative. Whether he informed his wife or daughter, I couldn't say. I flipped through the documents, decades of theft laid bare. My fingers stopped on a recent letter, a purchase offer for my shares, addressed to Thomas Sullivan as legal representative of Margaret Sullivan. They tried to sell my shares without my knowledge. It wasn't a question. The offer was declined, Richard said. Thomas claimed you were uninterested in selling, but demanded the negotiations go through him. When the board insisted on speaking with you directly, communications stalled. I closed the folder, a strange calm settling over me. What are my options now? You could sell your shares. They're worth considerably more now than when David purchased them. You could maintain ownership and begin receiving your rightful dividends. Or, Richard hesitated, you could exercise your right as a shareholder to review all recent contracts, including venue bookings. Like my granddaughter's wedding, I said softly. Precisely. As a part owner, you have certain privileges regarding the property's use. Dorothy shifted beside me. Maggie, are you thinking what I think you're thinking? I stared at the folder in my hands, years of lies and manipulation compressed into papers and statements. Then I looked up at Richard, a plan already forming. I need to become an active shareholder immediately, I said. And I need to do it without my family knowing until after I've reviewed certain contracts. Richard's eyebrows rose slightly. That's certainly possible, but... And I'll need access to all communication between Lakeside Manor and the Sullivan family regarding this weekend's event. A hint of a smile touched Richard's lips. I take it you're not planning to disrupt the wedding? No, I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. I'm planning to host it. I returned to the Sullivan mansion just after lunch, armed with knowledge that felt like both a shield and a sword. The house was in chaos. Caroline barking orders at caterers, Thomas secluded in his home office. No one had noticed my absence. Amber sat in the sunroom, surrounded by bridesmaids. I paused in the doorway, watching her laugh and toss aside gift cards after barely reading them. She noticed me hovering and her smile faltered. "Grandma, where have you been?" "Taking care of some business in Millfield," I replied. "On the day before my wedding?" Her tone suggested I'd committed some sin. It couldn't wait. I stepped fully into the room. Actually, it was about Lakeside Manor. Something flickered across Amber's face. Wariness, perhaps. "What about it?" "I was thinking about making some special arrangements for tomorrow." "A little surprise." Caroline materialized beside me, as though summoned by the word surprise. Her smile was fixed, her eyes calculating. "What kind of surprise, Maggie?" "Just a small addition to honor David's memory," I said smoothly, "since Millfield meant so much to him." Caroline's hand closed around my arm, steering me from the room. "Let's discuss this privately, shall we?" In the hallway, her facade dropped. "I don't know what you're playing at, but this wedding has been planned for months. We don't need last-minute surprises from someone who's barely part of this family." I met her gaze steadily. "I'm more a part of this family than you know, Caroline." "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means I visited Richard Hamilton this morning." The color drained from her face so quickly, I thought she might faint. Her fingers fell away from my arm. "Richard Hamilton," she repeated, barely audible. "David's lawyer," I clarified unnecessarily. "We had a very informative conversation about Lakeside Manor." Caroline's eyes darted up and down the hallway. "Thomas!" she hissed. "Thomas, come here right now!" My son emerged from his office, irritation clear on his face. "What is it? I'm on a call with—" "She knows," Caroline cut him off. "About Lakeside Manor." Thomas stared at his wife, then at me, comprehension dawning. He ended his call without a word and stepped into the hallway, closing his office door behind him. "Mother," he said, his voice eerily controlled. "Let's talk in the study." I followed them into the wood-paneled room that smelled of Thomas's expensive cigars. Caroline closed the door forcefully. "How much did Richard tell you?" Thomas asked without preamble. "Everything," I said simply. "The investment David made, how your grandparents diverted the funds, how you continued the deception after they died." "It wasn't like that," Thomas began, but Caroline interrupted. "Of course it was like that," she snapped. "Your grandparents took what should have been your mother's, and we knew about it when we found those documents after they died. Let's not pretend otherwise." She turned to me, arms crossed. "So what do you want? Money?" I looked at my daughter-in-law, really looked at her, and saw not just coldness, but fear. She'd built her life on certain assurances that my presence threatened. "I want the truth to come out," I said, "and I want my rightful place at my granddaughter's wedding, not as a tolerated outsider, but as the part owner of the venue you've been so proudly telling everyone about." Thomas sank into a leather chair, looking suddenly older. "Does Amber know?" "Not yet. Thank God for small mercies," Caroline muttered. "But she will," I continued. "After the wedding." Thomas looked up sharply. "After?" I nodded. "I have no intention of ruining her day. Unlike some people, I put family before personal gain." The barb landed. Caroline's perfect posture faltered, while Thomas had the decency to look ashamed. "What do you want from us?" he asked quietly. "Right now? Nothing. The wedding will proceed as planned. But afterward, we're going to have a long overdue conversation about honesty, family, and restitution." Lakeside Manor looked like something from a fairy tale. White columns wrapped in ivy, expansive lawns rolling down to the water's edge where autumn's sun turned the lake to molten gold. Guests in formal wear milled about the garden terrace, champagne flutes in hand. I stood apart from the main crowd, taking it all in. This place, this beautiful property, had been partly mine for decades. Its profits diverted, its connection to me deliberately obscured. Yet seeing it now, I felt no bitterness, only a strange sense of homecoming. "Mrs. Sullivan?" A venue staff member approached. "The ceremony will begin in 15 minutes. May I show you to your seat?" "Thank you, but I know where I'm going." I smiled, enjoying the small power of familiarity with a place I'd only physically visited yesterday. I made my way to the ceremony area, where white chairs faced an arbor festooned with roses. The front row on the bride's side had a gap, the seat Thomas had grudgingly allocated to me. Not quite family, not quite stranger. Instead, I chose a seat in the third row, beside Dorothy. Close enough to see, far enough to observe unnoticed. Nervous, Dorothy whispered as I settled beside her. Strangely, no. And it was true. The shakiness that had plagued me since arriving in Boston had vanished. In its place was a calm certainty, not about what would happen, but about who I was. The guests took their seats as the music shifted. Thomas and Caroline processed down the aisle, picture perfect in their formal attire. If you didn't know them, you'd never guess the tension beneath their poised exteriors. Ryan and his groomsmen took their places by the arbor, his expression a mixture of joy and anxiety, normal pre-wedding jitters or awareness of the undercurrents threatening this family. The music swelled, heads turned. Amber appeared at the end of the aisle, radiant in white, her train floating behind her. Alone, she'd insisted on walking herself down the aisle, a modern bride making her own choices. As she passed our row, her eyes flickered briefly toward me. No smile, but no coldness either, just recognition. The ceremony was beautiful in its simplicity, traditional vows spoken with genuine emotion, rings exchanged with trembling fingers. Whatever complications swirled around them, Amber and Ryan's affection seemed real. At the reception, I sat at a table far from the main wedding party, a placement that would have stung yesterday, but now felt strategic. I could observe everything: Caroline's brittle laughter as she moved from table to table, Thomas's increasing reliance on scotch as the evening progressed. "They think they've dodged a bullet," Dorothy murmured, "that you'll wait until Monday for your confrontation." "I will," I confirmed. "Today isn't about the past, it's about their future." "Speaking of futures," Dorothy nodded toward the ballroom entrance. "Isn't that your painting?" I turned to see two staff members carefully hanging my family portrait in a prominent position, exactly where I'd instructed the venue manager to place it yesterday, using my newly acknowledged authority as a part owner. Across the room, Caroline noticed too. Her champagne glass froze halfway to her lips, her expression cycling through shock, outrage, and calculation. She said something urgent to Thomas, who turned to look at the painting, then at me. Our eyes met across the crowded room. I raised my glass slightly, my expression neutral, not gloating, not challenging, simply present. The day after the wedding, I awakened early in the guest room of the Sullivan Mansion. Amber and Ryan had departed for their honeymoon, a 2-week Mediterranean cruise. Thomas and Caroline had gone to their country club, maintaining their Sunday routine despite the circumstances. I packed methodically, preparing for my return to Connecticut. Tomorrow's meeting with Richard and the Lakeside Manor Board would formalize my position as a shareholder. The next day would bring the financial accounting, the uncomfortable questions, the legal implications of decades of diverted funds. As I folded my dress, my phone rang. Richard Hamilton. "Maggie," he said gravely, "there's been a development." My heart stuttered. "What kind of development?" "Thomas came to my office this morning with his own attorney. He wants to meet today, not tomorrow." I sat heavily on the bed. "I see." I advised against changing our timeline, but he was insistent. He mentioned something about getting ahead of the situation. A cold certainty settled in my stomach. He's going to try to contest my ownership. Possibly. Given the statute of limitations for fraud is 7 years in Massachusetts, he can't deny your rights to the property, but he could argue that your inaction constitutes abandonment of the asset. That would be difficult, given that I didn't know the asset existed, I pointed out. "Yes, but legal battles aren't about what's right. They're about what can be argued convincingly to a judge." Richard sighed. I'd hoped for a more amicable resolution. After ending the call, I considered my options. I could meet Thomas on the battlefield he'd chosen. Lawyers, arguments, perhaps court. Fight for what was rightfully mine with the same weapons used against me for decades. Or I could change the game entirely. I dialed Dorothy, who answered immediately. "I need a favor," I said. "Actually, several favors." 2 hours later, I sat in Richard's office, reviewing the documents he'd prepared. Not the confrontational demands he'd originally drafted, but something different, something that had surprised him. "Are you certain about this approach?" he asked, adjusting his glasses. "You'd be leaving significant money on the table." "I'm certain," I replied. "Money has never been what this was about." The door opened, and Richard's assistant showed in Thomas, accompanied by a sharp-faced woman in a severe suit, his attorney. My son looked tired, the previous day's celebration and current stress evident in the shadows beneath his eyes. "Mother," he said stiffly, "this is Patricia Whitman, my attorney." I nodded acknowledgement. "This is Richard Hamilton, whom you know, and this," I gestured to Dorothy, "is Dorothy Wilson, a witness to much of our family history." Thomas's eyes narrowed at Dorothy's presence, but he said nothing. "I understand you wanted to meet today," I began. "To get ahead of the situation." "Yes." Thomas glanced at his lawyer, who opened her briefcase and extracted a folder. "We've prepared a settlement offer," Ms. Whitman said crisply. "While we acknowledge that certain financial arrangements regarding Lakeside Manor were improperly handled, we believe the statute of limitations would significantly complicate any legal claim Mrs. Sullivan might make." Richard started to object, but I placed a hand on his arm. "What exactly are you offering?" Ms. Whitman slid a document across the table. "A one-time payment of $50,000 in exchange for Mrs. Sullivan relinquishing all claims to Lakeside Manor and signing a non-disclosure agreement." I didn't bother looking at the paper. $50,000 for 45 years of diverted income from an 8% ownership stake in a property worth millions? Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "Mother, be reasonable. This could get messy if we take it to court." "Messy for whom?" I asked quietly. No one answered. I reached into my folder and withdrew the documents Richard had prepared at my request. "I have a counter-offer." Ms. Whitman's expression remained professionally neutral, but Thomas leaned forward slightly, wariness in his eyes. "I will transfer my 8% ownership of Lakeside Manor into a trust," I said, sliding the papers toward them. "The Sullivan Family Trust, with 3 beneficiaries, Thomas Sullivan, Amber Sullivan Reynolds, and any children Amber may have in the future." Thomas blinked. "A trust? As for the diverted income," I continued, "I'm establishing a scholarship fund with the money owed to me, approximately $1.2 million, according to Richard's calculations. This fund will support young artists from Millfield who need financial assistance." "I don't understand," Thomas said slowly. "You're giving it away?" "Not giving it away. Directing it towards something meaningful." I met his gaze directly. "Something that honors both your father's investment and my own sacrifices." Ms. Whitman flipped through the documents with growing confusion. "There must be a catch. What are your demands?" "Just one." I took a deep breath. "The truth. I want a family meeting. You, Caroline, Amber, when she returns from her honeymoon. I want to tell my story, all of it, with Dorothy present to corroborate the parts she witnessed. And I want you to listen. Really listen." Thomas stared at me. "That's all you want? To tell your side?" "That's all I've ever wanted." "Thomas, for 45 years." Ms. Whitman leaned toward my son, whispering urgently, but he waved her off. "When?" he asked simply. "When Amber returns. This involves her too." Thomas studied the documents for a long moment, then looked up with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You could take everything. Why aren't you?" "Because it was never about the money," I said softly. "It was about being erased from my own family's story." As they left with copies of my proposal, I felt lighter than I had in decades, not because I'd won. There were no winners in this family tragedy, but because for the first time since David died, I was acting rather than reacting. "Well," said Dorothy after the door closed, "that wasn't what I expected." Richard shook his head, a reluctant smile forming. "Nor I. But I think, Maggie, you may have found the one approach they weren't prepared to fight." "Which is?" "Generosity," he said simply. "The one weapon they've never used themselves." That evening, as I drove back to Connecticut, Dorothy called with surprising news. "Thomas contacted me," she said. "He's been asking questions about what really happened after David died, about the letters his grandparents intercepted." "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That I saved copies of some of your letters, the ones I managed to rescue before his grandparents destroyed them. That I saw them tell him you never called when you called every Sunday. That they returned your gifts with 'address unknown' written on the packages." I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "How did he react?" "He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked if I still had those letters." Dorothy paused. "I told him yes. He's coming to see them tomorrow." "After all these years," I murmured, "he's finally asking questions." People can change, Maggie, even after decades of believing a lie. Sometimes I agreed, though part of me wondered if Thomas was simply looking for weaknesses in my position before our family meeting. Either way, the truth was finally emerging from the shadows. The 2 weeks of Amber and Ryan's honeymoon passed in a strange limbo. I returned to my Connecticut home, resuming my quiet routines. But everything felt different, as though I'd brought back a new version of myself from Boston. I painted differently too. Bolder strokes, brighter colors, less concern for others' judgment. The Maggie who cared desperately for approval had stayed behind in that mansion. Thomas called 3 times. Brief, awkward conversations about the family meeting scheduled for the Saturday after Amber's return. He'd signed the trust documents, he informed me. Caroline was processing the situation. Amber hadn't been told anything yet. She deserves to enjoy her honeymoon, he said, a protective note in his voice. I agree, I replied, surprised by his consideration. On his 3rd call, Thomas's tone changed. I've been to see Dorothy, he said, his voice strained. She showed me your letters, and the gifts you sent that were returned. I waited, my heart pounding. I don't know what to say, he continued, except that I'm starting to see things differently. I've started seeing a therapist to help process everything. It wasn't an apology, but it was the first crack in the wall between us. When the day of the family meeting arrived, I dressed with care in a deep green suit I'd bought specially. Dorothy picked me up in her Buick, and we drove to Millfield together. Thomas had suggested the Millfield Inn, a neutral location, not his home with its loaded history, nor Lakeside Manor with its complicated ownership. They were already seated when we arrived. Thomas, Caroline, Amber, and Ryan. My entrance stilled their conversation. 4 pairs of eyes tracking my movement as Dorothy and I took our places. Thank you for coming, I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. Amber looked tanned and rested from her honeymoon, but confusion clouded her features. Dad said this was important family business. Something about Lakeside Manor? Thomas cleared his throat. Yes, but it's complicated. More than I initially explained. Maybe we should start at the beginning, I suggested gently. With the truth, all of it. Caroline shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. Thomas nodded, looking unexpectedly vulnerable. I began my story, not with recriminations, but with love. My love for David, his diagnosis, our desperate financial situation, the impossible choice I'd faced, stay with my 8-year-old son but watch my husband die without treatment, or accept the job in Chicago that offered health insurance and enough income for specialized care. Your grandparents presented it as an easy solution, I told Thomas. They would care for you while I established us in Chicago. Once David was receiving treatment and I had secured housing, you would join us. I remember being afraid of moving to Chicago, Thomas said quietly. Afraid of hospitals. Grandma and Grandpa said I could stay until Dad got better. Yes, I nodded. What you couldn't have known was that they never intended for that arrangement to be temporary. They'd always resented David for taking me away from Millfield. Dorothy spoke up, describing how my in-laws had intercepted my letters, told Thomas I was too busy with my new life to call, gradually rewriting the narrative until I became the villain. I worked in their home, she said. I saw it happen, day by day. The half-truths that became outright lies, the gifts from your mother that disappeared before reaching you. Thomas's face had gone pale. I remember asking why Mom never called. Grandma said the long-distance charges were too expensive for her. I called every Sunday at 4 p.m., I said softly. For 2 years, until they changed their number without telling me. Amber was watching her father intently, her expression unreadable. Why are you telling us this now, after all these years? I explained about Lakeside Manor, about David's investment, about the decades of diverted funds. As I spoke, Caroline's posture grew increasingly rigid, while Thomas seemed to physically shrink into himself. So you own the venue where we got married, Amber said slowly. And you knew before the wedding. I found out the day before the rehearsal dinner, I confirmed. And you didn't say anything? There was an accusation in her voice, but also confusion. You let the wedding happen, knowing what? I asked gently. That your grandparents lied? That your father continued a deception he may not have fully understood? Those weren't your burdens to bear on your wedding day. But they're our burdens now, Ryan said. Speaking for the first time, he placed his hand over Amber's on the table. All of this history, it affects all of us. Yes, I acknowledged. It does. That's why I've chosen to handle it the way I have. I explained my decision about the trust, about the scholarship fund. Silence fell when I finished speaking. Thomas stared at the table, Caroline looked out the window, and Amber studied me with an intensity that reminded me of David. "I have questions," she said finally. "Lots of questions. I'll answer them all," I promised. "No more secrets. Why didn't you fight harder?" The question burst from Thomas suddenly, his voice raw. "If you loved me so much, why didn't you come and take me away?" The question I'd asked myself 1,000 times. "I tried," I said, my voice breaking. "I consulted lawyers, but your grandparents had resources I couldn't match. They threatened to expose David's mental health struggles if I pursued custody, information that would have destroyed his professional reputation and voided his life insurance." I took a shuddering breath. "And then, when you were 12, you told me yourself that you didn't want to live with me. Do you remember?" Thomas frowned, then understanding dawned. "The summer visit, when you came to take me to the lake." I nodded. "You said your home was with Grandma and Grandpa now, that I was just the woman who sent checks." The memory still had the power to cut. "I didn't know then how thoroughly they'd poisoned your perception of me." Dorothy reached over to squeeze my hand as tears spilled down my cheeks. Across the table, Thomas's eyes had grown wet as well. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I didn't know any of this." "Perhaps not consciously," Caroline said, surprising us all. "But there were signs. I found letters from Richard Hamilton in your parents' papers after they died. I showed them to you, but we both chose to ignore them. It was easier than questioning everything we thought we knew." Her admission hung in the air, the first honest thing she'd ever said to me. Amber stood abruptly. "I need some air." She looked at Ryan, who rose immediately to join her. "We'll be back. I just need to process this." After they left, silence descended again, heavier this time. "What happens now?" Thomas asked finally. "That," I said gently, "is up to all of us." The reconciliation didn't happen overnight. It couldn't, after decades of misunderstanding and hurt. But that day marked the beginning of a slow, careful rebuilding. Fall gave way to winter, the New England landscape transforming with the familiar alchemy of seasons. My Connecticut home became a gathering place, tentatively at first, then with increasing frequency. Thomas came alone initially, a week after our meeting at the Millfield Inn. He sat awkwardly in my living room, surrounded by my paintings, struggling to reconcile the mother he'd imagined with the woman before him. "I've been seeing a therapist twice a week," he admitted, trying to understand how I could have believed something so completely that wasn't true. "We believe what we need to believe," I said, "especially as children." He looked up, his eyes searching my face. "Did you hate them? My grandparents?" I considered carefully. "Not hate. I resented them for taking you from me. I was angry that they manipulated the situation. But they loved you, Thomas. In their way, they thought they were doing what was best. By lying?" The edge in his voice suggested he wasn't ready to extend the same understanding. "By keeping you in Millfield, with stability and their version of family." I sighed. "I'm not defending their actions. What they did was wrong, but hating them won't change the past." "How are you not bitter?" he asked, genuine confusion in his voice. I gestured to the paintings that covered my walls, landscapes, portraits, abstracts that captured moments of beauty I'd found even in my loneliest years. "I made a life," I said simply. "Not the one I would have chosen, but a life with meaning. Bitterness would have poisoned that." Thomas visited again 2 weeks later, bringing childhood photos I'd never seen. Birthdays, school plays, vacations, filling in the gaps of the years I'd missed. It was painful, but also a gift, a willingness to include me in his history, however belatedly. Carolyn came with him the third time, her perfect facade noticeably softened. She brought Amber's childhood album, awkwardly explaining that she thought I might like to see it. "I wasn't kind to you," she said as we turned the pages together. "I judged you based on a story I never questioned." "You protected your family as you understood it," I replied. "I can respect that, even if the methods were flawed." She looked startled, as though kindness was the last thing she'd expected. Amber and Ryan visited at Thanksgiving, not for the actual holiday, which they spent with his family, but the weekend after. They brought pumpkin pie and questions, so many questions. About David, about my life as an art teacher, about how I'd survived the years of separation. "I've been thinking about your scholarship fund," Amber said as we washed dishes together. "For young artists from Millfield." "What about it?" I handed her a plate to dry. "I'd like to help. Maybe expand it to include mentorships." She hesitated. I've been reconsidering some of my own choices. Marketing isn't fulfilling me the way I thought it would. What would? I asked. I'm not sure yet. Ryan's been encouraging me to take some art history courses. I always loved that in college, but Dad said it wasn't practical. I watched her dry the plate with careful attention. This granddaughter I was only beginning to know. You have time to figure it out. That's a gift not everyone gets. 1 year after Amber's wedding, we gathered at Lakeside Manor for the official launch of the Sullivan Arts Scholarship. The venue's grand ballroom had been transformed into a gallery, displaying works by the scholarship's first recipients, alongside several of my own paintings. I stood near the entrance, watching people filter in, community members, artists, educators, and my family. Thomas arrived alone, looking more at ease in himself than I'd ever seen him. His separation from Caroline had become permanent 3 months ago, their divorce proceeding with surprising civility. Quite a turnout, he said, joining me. The director says they've never had this many people for an exhibition opening. People are curious, I replied. And the students' work is remarkable. So is yours. He nodded toward a wall where 3 of my paintings hung, landscapes of Millfield across different seasons. Amber and Ryan arrived next, slightly breathless from rushing. They'd moved to a small house 30 minutes from mine in Connecticut, where Amber was thriving in her graduate program in art history. Sorry we're late, Amber said, kissing my cheek. Traffic was terrible. She looked around the room, eyes widening. Wow, Grandma, this is amazing. Caroline arrived last, elegant as always, but somehow softer around the edges. She'd surprised everyone by becoming actively involved in the scholarship program, lending her organizational skills to ensure its success. The caterers are ready whenever you want to begin, she told me. And the press is here, local papers and the regional arts magazine. I nodded, suddenly nervous about the short speech I was expected to give. Dorothy appeared at my elbow, as if sensing my anxiety. You'll do fine, she assured me. Just speak from the heart. The event director called for attention, introduced me with a brief biography. As I moved to the small podium, faces turned toward me, some familiar, many unknown, all attentive. Thank you for coming tonight, I began, my voice steady. The Sullivan Arts Scholarship was born from a belief that art connects us across time and circumstance, that it can heal wounds, bridge divides, and tell truths when words fail. I glanced at my family, standing together near the front of the room. Thomas, Amber, Ryan, even Caroline. Not the picture-perfect unit I'd once imagined, but real people with real flaws and real capacity for growth. This scholarship honors my late husband, David Sullivan, whose investment years ago made it possible. It honors the young artists of Millfield, whose talent deserves nurturing. And it honors the power of truth, sometimes painful, always necessary, to transform lives. After my speech, as people mingled and admired the artwork, Richard Hamilton approached me. Though retired, he'd remained involved in finalizing the legal structures for the scholarship and trust. Congratulations, Maggie, he said, raising his glass of champagne. David would be proud. I think he would, I agreed. Though probably surprised as well, Richard smiled. Life rarely follows the path we expect, does it? I glanced across the room where Amber was introducing Ryan to one of the scholarship recipients, her hands animated as she explained something about the young woman's painting technique. Thomas stood nearby, listening with genuine interest. No, I said softly. It doesn't. Later, as the evening wound down, I found myself alone in a quiet corner of the gallery. Dorothy joined me, easing her aging joints into a chair with a sigh. Well, was it everything you hoped? She asked. I considered the question carefully. It was different, better in some ways, harder in others. She nodded understanding. That's life for you. Never quite what you pictured. My gaze fell on the family portrait I'd completed in the spring, the centerpiece of my displayed work. Thomas had insisted it be included, despite its unflinching honesty. Or perhaps because of it. They laughed at my painting, I said, remembering the rehearsal dinner a year ago, the humiliation that had sparked this journey. Now they've put it on display, because they finally saw what you were trying to show them, Dorothy replied. Not just an image, but a truth. Thomas approached, champagne flute in hand. Mom, Amber and Ryan are about to leave. They wanted to say goodbye. As I crossed the room toward my granddaughter and her husband, I passed the spot where my wedding gift had been mockingly dismissed a year ago. The memory no longer stung, not because it had lost its power, but because it had been transformed into something else, the beginning of a story, rather than its bitter end. Amber embraced me, whispering, "I'm so proud to be your granddaughter," words I'd once despaired of ever hearing. They had laughed at the gift I made with love. I had stayed silent and sold the wedding venue they bragged about. But that wasn't the end of our story. It was only the beginning. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.